Welcome to this ABC News special. Greg Jennett with you as hundreds of thousands of Australians go about casting their ballots for the May 21 election. We're giving you a glimpse into one of the largest troves of data collected on the issues and the policies that matter to you. The ABC's Vote Compass has so far clocked almost 1 million responses in election 2022, answers to questions on the broad policy areas felt to be important, and also to more specific questions, which are then used to map where you might stand in relation to the major parties' positions. Now, in a moment, we'll hear from our Vote Compass reporter, Bridget Brennan, who's been trawling through the trends in that trove. First, though, here's Bridget's breakdown of the main topics and concerns nominated by voters as front of mind to them.
Deadly bushfires and devastating floods have left scores of Australians picking up the pieces in the past 3 years. Exacerbated by climate change, it's predicted our natural disasters will intensify as the climate continues to warm.
I think the lived experience that people have had around floods, drought and bushfires has made climate change a front of centre issue for many Australians.
When Vote Compass asked what the most important issue is for voters at this election, more Australians singled out climate change than any other issue. 29% of Australians said climate change was their number one concern. But when we look more closely at voter intention, it's not as clear-cut. Climate change was the top issue for Labor and Greens voters, but it ranked fourth for Liberal National voters. For coalition voters, it wasn't as important as the economy and finance, the cost of living, and defence and security. Labor voters told Vote Compass that after climate change, they're most worried about the cost of living and government accountability. 50% of Greens voters chose climate change as their most pressing issue, followed by the environment and the cost of living.
Coalition voters are clearly much more interested in the economy, they're much more interested in defence, the issues the government is running on, rather than the issues that Labor and the Greens are running on.
The rising cost of living is putting enormous strain on many families, and Vote Compass shows it's now in Australians' top two concerns. Ahead of the last election in 2019, it was ranked 11th.
Real wage growth has not gone up for quite some time, probably the best part of 2 decades.
For 2 years, our lives have been dominated by the pandemic, yet COVID didn't make it into Australians' top 10 when Vote Compass asked about your most important issue. To tell us what you think and find out how your views align with those of Australia's political parties, visit Vote Compass online and fill out the survey yourself.
Well, Bridget's briefly brought up there the league ladder of pressing concerns identified by voters. Climate, cost of living and the economy are all there, of course, near the top. But let's bring her back in now for some further analysis. And Bridget, with every passing election, Vote Compass is a deepening vault of data. Can we compare shifts in emphasis on the issues that matter to Australians between 2019, the last election, and this election? What really stands out to you, Bridget?
We certainly can, Greg, and what stands out to me is cost of living. Now, the cost of living is soaring due to many international global factors, and we can see that Australians are deeply concerned about the rising cost of living. In fact, some of the people we spoke to about the Vote Compass data, just everyday Australians, have told us they're struggling to make ends meet like never before. They're struggling to put fuel in their car and put food on the table. And cost of living is now the second concern when we look at the Vote Compass data. Back in 2019, Greg, it was 11th. Can you imagine it being that far down? You know,
the good old days, they might have called those.
Yeah. So back then, people were more interested in the economy and finance, so things like taxation and our finance system. But, I mean, that is still a top issue for a lot of voters, but cost of living has now gone to the second ranking, just below climate change, where 29% of Australians said that would be their top issue at this election. So I think we can really see that that is going to be front and centre for a lot of Australians next weekend.
Yeah, that's a marked shift, to be sure. Now, the pandemic, of course, Bridget, turned society on its head for at least a couple of years, even longer for some of us. How has that altered, or did it in fact alter, the prominence of health and of aged care as policies of concern?
Well, when we looked at some of those issues of salience and those top issues that people are concerned about coming into the election, actually COVID was well down. It didn't actually even make it into our top 10, Greg, which is quite interesting given, as you said, it absolutely dominated our television screens and our politics for the past 2 years. Perhaps an indication that we are getting on with things now and we're looking to other issues of concern. However, of course, aged care was a huge talking point for a lot of Australians. It's an issue very relevant to a lot of Australian families. And what we found when we asked people about aged care is that overwhelmingly we want an increase for those workers who work in our aged care homes and in the aged care system. That was one of the recommendations of the Royal Commission into aged care, and Vote Compass shows actually about 82% of Australians either agree strongly or somewhat that the federal government should fund a pay increase. And Greg, Australians aged over 65, about 60% strongly agreed with that pay increase. So that's an issue of concern. Childcare, of course, was free for a little while there, which was fantastic for some families during the pandemic, or many families, I should say. And actually, we also want, what we can see from Vote Compass, we also want a larger share to be paid for by the federal government. Now, that differs when you look across party lines, as do all of the issues. There is a partisan split on some of these questions, but we found women were more likely to support a larger share of childcare fees being paid for by the federal government.
Yeah, we might be able to break out some of those points a little later in our coverage. Just finally, national security. China and Solomon Islands, of course, been pretty prominent. Bridget, what does Vote Compass tell us about how prominent that is in the minds of voters?
Well, Greg, one security analyst and expert on foreign aid and China and our relationship with the Asia Pacific said to me, the Vote Compass data actually confirms what experts in this area are saying, which is that Australians' view on China is souring, and quite quickly. It's become obviously a focal point of the federal election campaign, like we haven't seen probably in the last 10 years. And new data from Vote Compass shows that many Australians think the government should actually be taking a harsher line with China. Almost 60% of people said they agreed with that statement, and about 24% were neutral and 12% said they disagreed. So most Australians think we could be taking a stronger stance with China, Greg.
Yeah, and interesting how responsive the parties are to that in their own individual ways. Bridget Brennan, thanks so much for that update.
Thanks, Greg.
All right, well, fuel price surges, housing and even some everyday items like fresh food have all put a pinch on household budgets in recent times. That has made cost of living pressures something that both sides of politics have addressed constantly before and during the 6-week election campaign proper. But who hurts most from price rises? The old, the young, women or men? Well, Vote Compass data offers some insights into that too.
Artist and community worker Kalisha Ivory is making sacrifices to provide for her daughter. The single mum from northwest Tasmania is finding it impossible to secure stable housing, and the rising cost of everyday goods has been terrifying for her.
Until you've had to live off home brand milk and bread and make sacrifices to put food on the table and fuel in the car, I don't think you can empathise or understand what struggles we go through.
And Kalisha Ivory is not alone. When Vote Compass asked whether you're more worried about paying the bills compared to this time last year, 45% of Australians said yes, and almost 20% of those voters are much more concerned. And when we break that down for age groups, Australians aged 18 to 29 and 30 to 39 are more likely to be concerned. More than half of 18 to 29-year-olds are much more or somewhat more worried about their ability to pay the bills. And Australian women are 10% more likely than men to be much more worried about making ends meet. Many Australian households and businesses hit the wall during long lockdowns as COVID spread across the nation. But what about companies that increased their revenues during the pandemic? Vote Compass asked whether they should pay back any COVID-19 support they received from the government, and most Australians think they should. Close to 80% of voters agree strongly or somewhat that some companies should hand back the money they received as pandemic assistance. And Labor voters were more likely than coalition voters to think that some businesses should pay back money they received via JobKeeper. To tell us what you think and find out how your views align with those of Australia's political parties, visit Vote Compass online and fill out the survey yourself.
Well, for 6 weeks now, motorists have been enjoying a 22 cents a litre dip in prices at the Bowser, thanks, of course, to a halving of the fuel excise. Bad news is world oil prices are creeping up again and tax relief comes to an end in September. According to Vote Compass, many wish fuel taxes were lower still. Emily Baker has more on that, as well as responses to questions about COVID and corruption.
We've all been paying more at the petrol pump. For this dad of two, price hikes mean he's less likely to take the car.
We try to avoid now car trips, so you will rather go out for a walk around the block instead of going to a playground in Moncrief or somewhere else.
We asked how much tax you think there should be on petrol. Based on data from Vote Compass, 43% of Australians wish it was lower. Almost 40% say they're comfortable with where it is now, and fewer than 15% say they want more tax. The fuel excise has been halved for 6 months in the federal budget. Diane Deshmukh says that's welcome, if a little short-sighted.
Long term, we need to look into different options, I think.
Another big topic this election, COVID-19. The pandemic is still playing out nationwide. We asked whether the federal government should impose further restrictions to control its spread. According to Vote Compass, 45% of Australians disagree there should be more restrictions. 27% are neutral, but almost 30% want more. That's more common among Australians 65 and older. Last year, Australia Talks told us 9 out of 10 Australians want a federal anti-corruption watchdog. Vote Compass asked how much of a problem you think corruption is in Australia today. The results were overwhelming. 49% of people say it's very much a problem. Another 36% say it's somewhat a problem. Only 1% of people believe it's not a problem at all. And it crosses party lines. 63% of Liberal and National voters say corruption's an issue, as well as about 90% of Labor and Green voters. To tell us what you think and find out how your views align with those of Australia's political parties, visit Vote Compass online and fill out the survey yourself.
Unemployment's running at historically low levels right now, presenting many people with opportunities for more work. Well, that might be a simple choice if it wasn't for the costs incurred by doing more work. Childcare's a classic example, often wiping out any incentive for women in particular to do more hours. The answer, well, expressed through Vote Compass at least, is a strong desire for more assistance with childcare fees.
It was a major but temporary relief measure at the beginning of the pandemic. Free childcare for all was widely celebrated, but it didn't last.
We have to juggle 2 incomes to survive, and there's not really many other options.
Childcare fees can be a major hit to many families' budgets at a time when the cost of living is soaring. For the Telford family in Western Sydney, childcare is costing tens of thousands of dollars each year.
I'm basically stressed every fortnight just trying to make sure that I've got enough money to pay the daycare bills and meet our mortgage requirements.
It's a difficult financial balancing act for Kylie Telford. If she picks up extra hours as an ICU nurse, the childcare rebate is reduced and it's not worth it financially.
Unless you're really on top of the ball all the time, you might get caught out.
When Vote Compass asked what share of childcare costs should be paid for by the federal government, almost 60% of voters say the government should be paying somewhat more or much more towards childcare fees. And Australian women were more likely than men to support the government paying a bigger share of fees. A quarter of women say the government could be paying much more. And it was 18 to 29-year-olds and 30 to 39-year-olds who were more likely to support the government paying increased subsidies.
The next government really does need to act very quickly one, on lifting the subsidy, but two, on making sure that those really important educators and teachers within the early childhood workforce are coming through the system.
Aside from the cost of childcare, whichever party forms the next government will also need to deal with a critical shortage of educators. To tell us what you think and find out how your views align with those of Australia's political parties, visit Vote Compass online and fill out the survey yourself.
Standards of aged care have been a blight on the nation through the last few years, more so after the findings of the Royal Commission. At its core, especially through the pandemic, is a chronic shortage of workers, and those who do provide the care are among the lowest paid in the country. Now, the Fair Work Commission is considering a bid for a hefty pay rise, but arguments persist over who'd pick up the tab when that decision's handed down. The coalition's a little opaque on the split between government and providers. Labor's committed to funding any increase. Here's what the survey found on what voters reckon. Emily Baker reports.
During the day, Carlton Williams works in aged care, providing support to people in their homes. It's a job he loves, but one that doesn't pay particularly well. So at night and on weekends, he works at a local pub.
I get paid more to pour drinks, take out food and wait tables than I do sometimes to, I guess, look after someone's life.
Vote Compass asked whether the federal government should commit to funding a pay increase for aged care workers. More than 80% of voters say yes. There was support across voting intention, although that was stronger among Labor and Green voters. Women were more likely to agree. And while it was common among all age groups, sentiment was strongest amongst older Australians.
We're talking about roughly 200,000 Australian workers who are looking to get a relatively significant increase. The union movement would like them to get about 25%.
Unlike other parts of your body, you're likely to pick up the entire bill when it comes to looking after your teeth. Only a small number of Australians receive help through the public system, and wait times are usually long. Vote Compass asked whether Medicare should offer basic dental care to all Australians. The vast majority of Australians believe it should. Voters earning less than $1,000 a week were most likely to agree, and people are more supportive now than when we last asked in 2013.
Over the last couple of years, there's been this big discussion every day about public health, about prevention and things like that. And so I think that's why the public has come around.
Tell us what you think and see where you sit on the political spectrum. Go online and fill out Vote Compass yourself.
Crafting questions that are sharp, relevant, but not politically leading is almost a science in itself behind the Vote Compass process that's been running in several countries over the last decade or so. To provide as much rigour, accuracy and neutrality, expert input is sought along the way. Sydney University academic Peter Chen, who we just caught a sneak peek of in Emily's summary, was part of that process, and we spoke to him a little earlier. Well, Peter Chen, what's a politics and media university academic's role in overseeing the Vote Compass survey process?
I worked with the Vote Compass team as an academic advisor. So the Vote Compass team is based at the ABC and involves ABC staff, but also a contractor, Vox Pop Labs, which is based in Canada. And they did a lot of the research work and also the technical work in designing the interface. And the various academic advisors who were brought in looked at the various questions that were being proposed, created a number of questions that were asked in the survey that's administered to participants. And we were also involved in looking at some of the responses that political parties gave to the questions that are asked in the instrument there. Because at times, the researchers would flag things that the parties had said or published, but the parties would respond slightly differently. We adjudicated that material. So we worked to basically ensure that the process had a little bit of oversight externally from the ABC, and we made some recommendations about things to include within the survey itself.
So, Peter, how many questions does it take to make a fair assessment of someone's political position?
I think that's actually a really difficult question because the way in which people respond to politics and to elections is extremely variable. And researchers in the social sciences have demonstrated that there is a huge spectrum of the way in which people think about politics. And elections themselves are very complex and difficult decision-making opportunities for people. If you think about it, we ask voters to do three things when they decide on their vote. We ask them to think about policy issues that are important to themselves, their family, their community, where they sit and where the respective parties sit. But we also ask them to assess the performance of the previous government and to assess the likely performance of a range of alternative governments that might be formed, and taking all that information together, create two decisions, a lower house vote and an upper house vote. So in a way, it is obviously very, very difficult, if not impossible, for people to make a completely rational and reasonable decision in that regards. And so what we find is that different people make different sorts of decisions. Some people using the maxim that the best guide to future performance is past performance, spend a lot of time looking at how did the government perform, how did the opposition perform when it was in government the last time, and they make an assessment based on that performance about how well they think government will operate in the future and base their decision on that.
All right, so how do you gauge then what issues might resonate most with voters?
I think one of the interesting things that was included in the Vote Compass this election cycle was the ability for participants to put in a free text sort of way, an unstructured way, a list of issues that were important to them in that election. And based on hundreds of thousands of those responses, the Vote Compass team used artificial intelligence to analyse those and recategorise them together. And that gives the kind of list of issues that Vote Compass participants identified as of interest to them. Now, the advantage of that approach, as opposed to providing a preset list of topics which you can reorder or you can select a number off, is that it captures what's on the top of people's mind. It's unprompted recall. And clearly when people are voting, they're going to vote about things that are on their mind, not necessarily about an artificial list that's provided to them. So that approach is kind of interesting, but also I think what it demonstrates is that it does show that the Vote Compass results will be a little different to other research that's done where public opinion companies might poll people and provide them a preset list and ask them to order them.
Peter Chen from Sydney University, thanks for joining us tonight. You're watching an ABC News special picking through the data gathered by Vote Compass this election, with around 1 million responses sent in online so far. Now, Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese have sparred often over who'd be best to manage China, regional relations and national security. Vote Compass reveals many voters think Australia could actually be even tougher in its approach towards China, while also spending more on defence and foreign aid.
Australia's increasingly heated relationship with China has become a focal point of the campaign. Foreign policy and our influence in the Pacific is now a key measure of effective leadership alongside domestic issues. Vote Compass asked whether you think Australia should take a tougher stance when dealing with China. More than half of Australians want our government to take a stronger position on China. That reflects a relatively robust view across party lines, but it was coalition voters who strongly agreed that Australia should take a more strident approach when dealing with China. But about a quarter of voters were neutral on the question of how to manage our increasingly fraught relationship with China.
We know that the Australian public has soured on China. There isn't really a public mood for significant change in the relationship with China.
Our level of foreign aid, especially towards our Pacific neighbours, has also been in the headlines after the Solomon Islands signed a security arrangement with China. When Vote Compass asked how much Australia should spend on foreign aid, 45% of voters told us there could be somewhat more or even much more spent on foreign aid. Labor and Greens voters were more likely to support increased aid, but most Liberal National voters disagreed, saying the current foreign aid budget was about right or could be less.
And certainly these results show to me that there's a lot more room for the Australian government to be ambitious on the development program.
And on the question of defence spending, around a third of you told Vote Compass that current defence spending is about right. Close to 40% of voters said it could be higher. Perhaps an indication that Australians are becoming increasingly more alert to our position in what could be a volatile region. To tell us what you think and find out how your views align with those of Australia's political parties, visit Vote Compass online and fill out the survey yourself.
Cutting carbon emissions remains a goal for a majority of Australians, no matter which way they intend to vote. From that come more questions about how much people are personally prepared to pay themselves if it came to that. Vote Compass has asked those questions, with the sample weighted to reflect the Australian population.
When it comes to reducing her family's carbon footprint, Catherine Patterson knows every little bit counts. She's renovated her home to be more energy efficient, installed solar panels and compost where she can.
We also try and reduce waste around the house, and we do that by trying to consume a bit less. A lot of the furniture I have in my house is bought second-hand.
Catherine works for an environmental charity. She says governments of all levels should show leadership in cutting emissions.
And I think that would help people know that they're working on it and, that something's being done. And I think that would probably incentivise a lot of people to do things as well.
Vote Compass asked how much Australia should do to reduce its carbon emissions. The results were overwhelming. 79% of Australians think we should do more, almost 60% of those saying much more. Only 7% of Australians think we should do less. When we break that down along voting intentions, there's still majority support among coalition voters, but support is much stronger among people who vote for Labor, the Greens, and those who say they're voting for independents or other parties.
I think there has been a significant change in what we call the salience, the importance to which voters attribute the issue.
Vote Compass also asked how much you'd be willing to personally pay. 24% of people said between $100 and $500. 20% said $500 to $1,000. 15% said nothing at all.
That is really the big test of whether people see the issue as significant enough that they will, quote unquote, put their money where their mouth is.
Vote Compass asked whether Australia should stop exporting coal to other countries to be used for electricity. It's a polarising issue. About 1/3 of voters said they disagreed. Half agreed, 17% were neutral. Have your say and see where you sit on the political spectrum this election. Go online and fill out Vote Compass yourself.
I'm Greg Jennett. Thanks for your company.